Hi, welcome to The Good Fight on Blogging Heads TV. This is Aryeh Cohen-Wade, managing editor of Blogging Heads. And you're watching The Good Fight, where we try to bring together people who disagree on a topic and see if we can find some common ground. Uh, my guests today are Mark Schmitt, who is director of the program on political reform at the New America Foundation, and Ilya Shapiro, who is a senior fellow in constitutional studies at the Cato Institute. And we're going to be talking about money and politics today. Um, a few months ago, there was a 5-4 Supreme Court decision, McCutcheon versus FEC, which struck down caps on total contributions to candidates directly, but kept individual limits per candidate. And this has gotten campaign finance reformers even in feeling in even more dire straits than they were before. Mark, I'll start with you. Where do you think we are in terms of campaign finance after this latest Supreme Court ruling?
Well, we're clearly on the verge of going back to the almost completely deregulated system of the pre-Watergate era. This decision wasn't that monumental in itself because it's kind of it's a limit that wasn't really well enforced and a lot of people didn't really know existed. But it definitely further narrowed the scope of what the court is going to think of as corruption or the justification for any kind of contribution limits, and sets up a situation where the next time around they could wipe out the existing contribution limits, which are in themselves not that important anymore because so many doors are open to move money into politics through other channels, because of Citizens United, because of frankly going back to the Buckley v. Vallejo decision that allows individuals to spend money to influence an election, and then Citizens United opens that door up to corporations as well. Although that's that it's still primarily individuals that are doing this. But the contribution limits aren't that meaningful, except for somebody who's trying to raise money and doesn't have access to the big outside spenders, and is trying to get competitive by putting together enough money to run in contributions of $2,700 each. Which is hard to get and mostly available to incumbents. So we're going to a zone, I think, where either you have a pretty bad outcome, which is that the contribution limits make it really hard for a lot of people to run, but they also allow other candidates to just barrel over the system, backed by outside dollars or backed by large contributors, and and you have this free fall outside of the contribution limits. So it's really time to think about what's the next big step here, rather than just scraping back some pieces of the existing regulatory system.
Well, Aryeh, I think you already have your first point of agreement. I don't think there was anything there that Mark said that I really can quibble with. And just to make sure that everyone's on the same page that are watching this, what McCutcheon was about, and I agree with Mark's statement that it wasn't that big a deal. It was about aggregate contribution limits. That is, it didn't touch the 2,600 or what's going to be 2,700. It keeps rising every election cycle, how much an individual can give to a particular candidate. It didn't touch how much an individual can give to one particular party committee. But there's another cap that McCain-Feingold put in, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, on how much you can give total. That is, you can max out to only about 9.5 candidates as things stood before McCutcheon. So the obvious question was, well, why does giving that extra dollar to that 10th candidate or the 11th candidate, how is that corrupting the system or quid pro quo corruption or whatever the justification might be? And the court ruled 5-4 that it wasn't. And therefore, those approximately 630 people, that's all it is, that hit that contribution limit for, again, aggregate donations to candidates or party committees are now freer to spend more than what was added up arithmetically to be $123,000. And I agree that this is just the latest kind of in a drip step, that the court has been taking kind of small steps ever since really Justice Alito replaced Justice O'Connor. that you've had this string of 5-4 decisions, some more notable, some less, chipping away at sort of the Buckley versus Vallejo consensus, the idea that that the government can restrict contributions to candidates and campaigns, but not expenditures. And with Citizens United, that was big, not because it affected, again, candidate donations or spending or campaigns, but that opened up the door for independent speech, whether by corporations or unions. There has been greater activity on the union side, less on the corporation side, certainly less on the Fortune 500 type of corporations. It's mostly kind of trade associations, advocacy groups. Now we talk about 501c4s, which is kind of this category of social welfare organizations that are not for profit, but they're also not charities. Those types of groups have been ramping up after Citizens United, but not the money going to parties and candidates. And so after McCutcheon, one thing that we'll see, and Mark, I think, was alluding to this, is that the next challenges that have already we're seeing them being filed are being filed by parties to loosen some more of the restrictions on them in terms of how much, how parties can raise donations, how individual candidates can raise donations. Those contribution limits of one kind or another will be under attack in various ways in coming years.
Right. And I appreciate you kind of explaining it so well. It's an important aspect to add. The other decision that's important is the Speech Now decision, which followed Citizens United and allowed the creation of super PACs. So you've got a number of different vehicles now that are outside of the parties that are moving money into the system. Now, one argument that's sometimes made is that maybe there's a benefit to McCutcheon if it's actually bringing more money into the parties rather than through these outside groups, because when the aggregate limit is lifted, you're able to give more to the parties as well as to individual candidates. So you could give to every Republican candidate and all the Republican committees and so forth. And the argument that political scientists in particular make is that it's healthier to have money going through parties because parties are kind of accountable. They have a long-term relationship with voters. They have a reputation. They can't operate as the sort of, here they are and then they're gone type of organization like, say, Swift Boat Veterans in 2004 or something like that. But that's a very hypothetical argument. We don't really know that the money would go. The Supreme Court was kind of guessing at what would happen, and the majority had their speculation that it wouldn't matter at all. The minority had the argument that you could still have a very strong corrupting effect because money can be moved around, and it is moved around all the time. So you could, using somebody who's maxing out, find a way to drive, $500,000 from a donor into a particular race. It takes some moving around, but these guys do it. That's what election lawyers do is move money around, and they know how to do that. So it's a little bit speculative about what exactly McCutcheon would do, but McCutcheon itself isn't the biggest deal in the world. It's the trend that's the big deal.
Right, and ironically, what's sort of happening with the stream of decisions that have mostly been about independence speech, corporations, issue advocacy, all of these things going on the creation of super PACs with speechnow.org, is that the playing field is sort of unlevel as between independent speakers versus parties and candidates. Now, leveling the playing field is one of the interests that's often invoked by campaign finance reformers or people who want to restrict or regulate the campaign finance a bit more. And here you have the ironic situation, which Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart, the last presidential cycle, did a good bit of lampooning about, that parties and campaigns indeed are more hamstrung, relatively speaking, to the independent groups. And now, if even further shackles beyond McCutcheon are removed on donations to parties and candidates, will indeed we see more of a shift back towards parties and candidates, whether that's a good thing for accountability or just empirically whether we'll see that, or whether the genie is in fact now out of the bottle, and people who run these super PACs, who work independently, who form the future Citizens United organizations of whatever issue or on whatever side they want to be on, whether they like that independence and don't want to be tied too much, in terms of controlling the message that a particular candidate or particular party might want to project in a given race.
Right. I mean, the big thing is that the big reason to believe that the genie's out of the bottle, so to speak, is that these groups aren't very independent at this point. And so there's really plenty of good reason to run your money through Priorities USA or one of the other organizations, because the limit is that it has, in theory, it has to be independent and you can't be coordinating with a campaign, but we really don't have a regulatory structure that prevents coordination. You have people moving directly over from a campaign, lifelong operatives for a particular candidate moving over to create the kind of independent organization or super PAC or whatever. So there's not really much reason not to do that anymore, as long as if you have some greater level of freedom. Obviously, if you open up parties a little bit more, you might have a little bit more running through parties. But essentially, you've got big amounts of money that are still driving, primarily driving support for incumbents through the parties. Sometimes for more ideological candidates through the outside spending, but sometimes the outside spending is exactly the same as what parties want to do. So it's starting to become a little bit of a distinction without a difference.
And here's where we might start disagreeing, because I don't have much of a problem with more money going into politics. Americans still spend less on political campaigning than on Halloween candy or chewing gum or things like that any given election cycle. And corporations or anyone who has business with the government spend about 10 or 12 times more on lobbying on the back end, which is heavily controlled and rightly so, and heavily regulated, although also constitutionally protected as the right to petition your government for redress of grievances.
Well, lobbying is only regulated. I mean, there are gift bans, there's some employment restrictions, and there's disclosure. It's not, the amounts spent on lobbying aren't particularly regulated.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And that I think is telling, because there's more opportunities for corruption on the lobbying end. I mean, one of the reasons why big companies, the Fortune 500 companies, don't spend so much on campaigning, whether it's before or after Citizens United, is because it's much more effective to spend that dollar on lobbying, and also that way you don't alienate half of your potential clientele. When Michael Jordan was famously asked why he wasn't more involved in politics or civil rights activism or what have you, and he said, "Well, Republicans buy sneakers too."
Right.
And so,
well, I worked for the only politician that Michael Jordan actually cut a campaign ad for. Although it wasn't the most effective ad in the world. That was Bill Bradley when he ran for president in 2000. Let me back up.
But what you're saying though, money is going to find a way, whether it's to parties, you restrict those, you go to, the old 527 groups that are now down, given that we have the 501c4s and the super PACs, you close those avenues. Money is going to find a way somewhere, because it moves like water. It's too important. What government does is too important for money not to chase. And so ultimately, and this is perhaps a naive view, but it is, it's a libertarian view. The ultimate way to reduce money in politics is to reduce the size of the politics. If you shrink the size of the pie that people are going to go after, they won't spend as much money going after that. That's obviously a much larger structural concern than simply how you regulate campaigns given any given size of government or political space.
Right. Let me back up and say because I think there's a point of agreement and then there's a point of disagreement. One, I don't think there's too much money in politics. I've been writing about this, working on these issues for like 15 years. I've never written the words, get big money out of politics, get money out of politics. I think a robust political communication is a great thing. And I'm not at all concerned that there's too much money. I am concerned that it's too hard. The barriers to entry are very high. Many kinds of candidates can't get access to anything like the money to even begin to be heard. And certain candidates have a lot of money. Certain positions have a lot of money behind them. and it's not evenly distributed. And we see that in a lot of the deals that make up, both at the micro level of particular transactions that are related to donors, and the macro level with studies like the recent book by Martin Gillen's about the ways in which government seems to systematically favor the opinions of the well-off over the middle class and the poor. Kind of complicated research, but I think it paints a pretty clear picture that that money's not, money is certainly pulling the system on the basis of who doesn't have it as well as much as who does have it. So it's not too much money in politics. Now that libertarian solution that if you shrink government, people will have less need to try to interact with it and influence it. I don't think you'd have to get to a point where you really had if maybe it'd be an interesting experiment if you had like the cleanest tax system in the world, like something you just couldn't there was no
no way to get a loophole.
Right. There's nothing you could tinker with in that system. You had relatively the most, I wouldn't say just small, but the most uncomplicated and rigid barriers to making them more complicated. Maybe, but you're still going to have it. You still want there to be a robust contest for who's going to carry out policies. You're still going to have politics, and politics is going to be expensive. Communicating with voters, making your points of view known. You can't protect this tiny, minuscule night watchman state from ever being changed by people who want to change it in politics. So you're always going to have that contest there, and I think we have to accept that there's going to be a demand from. I don't fully buy the what you described as sometimes called the hydraulic theory of money in politics, that you squeeze the balloon one place, it goes somewhere else. I don't fully buy that. It's more a matter of the demand. There's always a demand and need for the ability to communicate in politics, and the question is how do we allocate that so that people do have a better chance to be heard? I tend to favor good public financing systems that strengthen the role of smaller donors, so that candidates who are relying on smaller donors can kind of compete on the same playing field as candidates who are relying on Sheldon Adelson to back them up from outside or from very large donors or candidates using their own wealth. So that
Sheldon Adelson doesn't have a very good track record of supporting winning.
No, he doesn't. And that's an argument.
Speaking of Sheldon Adelson, Ilya, I mean, are you troubled by the single wealthy donor who the candidates all have to go and kiss his ring? We saw that a few months ago where Chris Christie had personally apologized to Adelson for using the term occupied territories. Is this something that you think distorts our politics?
Well, amusingly enough, the individual donor has never been restricted in terms of independent spending. Citizens United doesn't affect one way or another what George Soros or Sheldon Adelson or the Koch brothers or anybody else, Tom Steiner now, the new guy in California, what they can do as individuals. Does it bother me that rich people can spend money on a lot of things? Well, no more than it bothers me that Sheldon Adelson can buy a bigger yacht than I can, or that he can buy a yacht and I can't. That's just the way it works. But everybody knows about him. It's not like he's. People talk about shadow money somehow, or dark money, or whatnot. But then they say, oh, those dark money Koch organizations. Oh, but if they're Koch organizations, what are you complaining about? It's apparently who's behind it, and the voters can judge whether it matters to them that Adelson or Soros or Bill Gates or whoever it is making a significant play in that space. So in the abstract, it doesn't really bother me, and more specifically in terms of the legal trends and the court's analysis, that doesn't go towards individual big donors. And we have to look at things multidimensionally as well. It's you talk about these donors as we have been. Well, what about the networks? What about the New York Times, Fox News, all of these media organizations, or advantages to incumbency? Or celebrity, Clay Aiken, the former American Idol, I guess, runner-up, ran in North Carolina. that probably helped that he's a bit of a celebrity. Do we try to equalize all of these things or regulate all of these potential advantages that someone has? So a charismatic, as Mark mentioned, the small donor-backed candidate, it's all college students, has a large volunteer army that some other candidates don't. Do we try to balance that? It just seems like it creates more trouble than whatever the original problem you're trying to solve is.
I just say a couple of things. I mean, one, we don't always know. There are some people have put themselves out there, and the Koch brothers have put themselves out there. We still don't know. There's plenty of their money that we don't actually know where it's going. So it's not like the voters can always say. I mean, we know it's Republicans, we know it's conservative Republicans, so it's not super complicated. But it's not like voters can always say, "Oh, I know that candidate was getting support from this." From these folks, and that, and therefore I'm going to weigh that in voting. We don't always know that. We don't know, for example, who just, there's a lot of money just went into the Tom Cotton campaign in Arkansas, the Senate campaign down there, a Republican challenger to Mark Pryor. We don't know where that money came from, and we may never know where that money came from. So
I gave him $200 a couple of months ago. Just FYI.
That will weigh. I'll count that in my decision if I were an Arkansas voter on whether to vote for it or not. But we just it's not all known. Some of it's known when people put themselves out there. And the other thing is, these things do have. Even though Adelson didn't have a great track record, he did do certain things in American politics that really shaped things in a different way. Newt Gingrich's candidacy in 2012 stayed alive. Where candidacies in the past, presidential candidates would kind of fall away in the past because of Sheldon Adelson. Is that good or is that bad? It's probably good to have a robust competition in the presidential primary, but that choice of who it was who stayed alive and who was able to compete was totally dependent on one individual. And plenty of other people who might make good presidents, good candidates, might have given Mitt Romney a run for his money, whatever, didn't have that access to stay in the race. Now, I don't want to I have no illusions about evening everything. There's definitely no possibility of evening everything. But elections are, rule-defined spaces where we want to make sure that a range of candidates can be heard, and that voters have an opportunity to hear some different options and make a choice among those options, knowing that there's going to be all kinds of advantages to incumbency or enthusiasm or celebrity or whatever else. But we're going to have some structure around them, and I think that structure ought to be one that at least offsets the influence of the giant donors by giving a boost to people who are dependent on a different set of donors.
Some of what you say is appealing, but then you have to consider what you earlier mentioned about barriers to entry in candidates who otherwise wouldn't get to run, that we don't even know about because they don't see a way of raising enough money. Gene McCarthy, the insurgent in 1968 against Lyndon Johnson, against the incumbent president, and eventually pushed him out of the race,
right,
was funded by 3 or 5 people,
right,
the Sheldon Adelsons of the anti-war left of the day.
Right.
Dwight Eisenhower, didn't want a campaign at all. He thought he was above that. And so the CEOs of a number of the biggest companies in America said, don't worry about that. Let us handle the money. He didn't even campaign that much. They basically ran the show for him. So these are obviously very different types, both ideologically, personality-wise, different area. But there are certainly going to be, whether you're a Green Party supporter or a Libertarian, third parties would be, rather than having a Ross Perot run himself as some quirky oddball candidate, nevertheless, touching on something, pulling in, 20% or 18% of the vote one year, or Steve Forbes running himself in the Republican primary, those types of people could instead fund somebody who's a better candidate espousing their same ideas. And so, even though, it seems, there's something not right with Newt Gingrich's campaign being held aloft solely because of this one guy. Like, ultimately, the voters got the results that they wanted. And if you don't like Newt Gingrich, you're not going to have Gene McCarthy. You're not going to have a whole host of different types of who knows what types of politicians we've lost through the need to have tapered donations. And indeed, it's probably more the ones that have mostly non-wealthy supporters, but can only attract maybe one or two wealthy ones that are being hurt, rather than ones that can have a lot of people, a lot of lawyers or bankers, whoever, that can max out.
Right. I mean, and I think there's a lot to that point, because people who are maxing out are not exactly small donors either. I mean, a relative of mine ran for Congress in the last cycle, and I didn't even quite max out. It was still like the largest amount of money my household spent in the whole year. So it's a you know, I don't want to depict those folks as small donors. You know, the Eugene McCarthy example is that is the great, you know, chestnut of the anti-reform argument. And of course, the problem is that Eugene McCarthy wasn't elected president. Richard Nixon was, and Richard Nixon was also dependent on a few wealthy donors like B.B. Rebozo and ITT and so forth, and was a complete crook. I mean, people who are dependent on individual donors have a very high propensity to corruption, because they owe so much to that individual donor if and when they are elected. And maybe McCarthy, you know, who knows, if Eugene McCarthy had been elected president, I think he probably would have been a pretty bad president. But if he had been elected president, Stuart Mott and those other donors would have, you know, quite a bit of leverage on them. When that's the classic corruption argument. That's the classic argument that, you know, at least a shadow of it still stands. That when you're able to give a politician so much money that they could not get anywhere without your money, you know, you have a potential leverage, whether you exercise it or not, that we don't want to allow in our politics.
But let's frame it a different way. I mean, what is, you know, forgetting the direct, you know, I'm sure we'll get in a moment about, you know, what the level of whether there should be a limit on contributions, what that limit should be. But in terms of just independent spending, which is mostly what Sheldon Adelson does in terms of his, you know, Gingrich-oriented super PAC or whatever the case may be. At the end of the day, that's independent speech. And if you're trying to restrict that, that's the government telling someone how much they can speak on a political issue, on what subject, and who can do it and at what time. I mean, you're getting into a very dangerous area. Again, unless there's, you know, some coordination, or contributions in kind, or you know, other sorts of things. But at the end of the day, that's what Citizens United was about. If somebody wants to, you know, whether they, you know, just left the other person's, the candidate's campaign 2 weeks ago, or whether they're just, you know, an individual idiosyncratic ideologue, they could have a lot of sway by saying, I'm about to spend a lot of money on your race, or I'm about to spend, you know, money on your opponent, unless you do this, unless you do that. And,
right.
You know, I think we need to separate bribery statutes, you know, quid pro quo corruption. You know, that clearly should be, you know, the DOJ, the Justice Department's Public Corruption Unit, looks at that all the time. But I think that's separate from regulating campaigns. I mean, you want to make sure that, I guess, foreign influences aren't buying them. You want to make sure that, you know, there's a whole host of, I guess, legitimate areas, but otherwise, stuff that gets into actually restricting individuals' ability, whether alone or getting together with other individuals, to speak about certain subjects, that gets dicey to me. And again, trying to regulate that, disclosure is another issue,
right.
Which I'm sure
let's get to disclosure in a minute. But I want to say I actually agree with you on a lot of that, because I mean, I don't agree in the sense that I think, you know, the coordination is real. We have circumstantial evidence of it when you see, for example, a political operative move over from a campaign to a super PAC or a C4. That's, you know, that's circumstantial, but it's pretty strong circumstantial evidence that there really is coordination going on. So if we accept that that's something that should be regulated and treated in the way that we regulate campaigns, then I think we should get serious about it. I do agree that it will be impossible and wrong, frankly, to regulate all kinds of truly independent spending. And one reason that it's so difficult to do is that in a polarized environment, speaking that really is about issues, becomes hard to distinguish from speech that's intended to influence the election. So in 2002, when they passed the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, McCain-Feingold, there was a lot of research about exactly what was happening with these so-called fake issue ads, the ad that said, call Congressman Jones and ask him why he's always raising your taxes. That was clearly didn't mean call Congressman Jones. It meant don't vote for Congressman Jones.
Right.
And it was, and they tried to draw a line that said, 60 days before an election, 30 days before a primary, if you're mentioning a candidate, we're going to think of it as intending to influence the election. Now, here we are 12 years later, and, I think it's about 150 days from the election, and you've got massive ad buys attacking Obamacare. You've got ad buys touting a minimum wage on the Democratic side. Those are clearly intended to shape the issue environment for the election in 2014. But it's really hard to say what's a line where we're going to say this really should be treated as election advertising and this shouldn't. And it is more than dicey. It's just not something we can or should expect to do to regulate that kind of speech about issues. And very often doesn't mention candidates at all. So that's why I think that it is both. I think it's both dicey and probably futile to go down that road, and that's why I'm much more interested in the kinds of systems that can, give people a better chance of being able to compete, even if there's a lot of spending, independent or otherwise, on the other side.
So Mark, just to clarify, so you seem to think, campaign finance regulation is at a dead end, and there's nothing else that can be done in terms of limiting spending. Is that right?
Well, I think that it's appropriate to have contribution limits. We should continue to have contribution limits. We should have regulations that make sure that independent spending actually is independent and is not coordinated with the candidates. And if you can do that, you can. Candidates and parties would generally prefer to control their own message rather than having it come from outside. And if you can manage that, I think you have the basis for a solid system, even acknowledging that you're going to have spending that's going to influence the election, that's going to be very unequal in its weight, that's going to empower some individuals, and that's just going to be life in a robust democracy. And so you want to offset it in certain ways. Now, disclosure might be another small part of managing that, especially if it helps you see where there's coordination and where there isn't. So I don't think it's at a dead end, but I don't think the next steps are most fruitfully found by trying to chase after every place where spending occurs, because ultimately you'll find a place where you can't control it. If you're closing everything down, the person who controls the path around your limits has a lot of power by definition. That's what Sheldon Adelson had, was the power of the fact that he had this money and other candidates didn't, because they were operating through this other system. So I want to really give people who have a base of support, who have a vision, who have a voice that can be heard in the political process. I want to get them into a competitive position. That's all I care about. And it doesn't have to be an even position. It just has to be a place where they can be heard. I look at things like the New York City campaign finance system, for example, which gives a 6-to-1 match on small contributions. You look at that at the end of the day. New York's not a city with a robust bipartisan competition. There's not much of a Republican Party. But if you look at the primaries in both parties, for example, the mayoral candidates in the Democratic primary last September finished in reverse order of the amount of private money they'd raised, because in other words, the candidate who had raised the most in private money came in third. The one who raised the least, Mayor de Blasio, came in first, in part because they were all able to be heard. The disparity in money didn't matter as much, even though there was a disparity in money. So systems like that can begin to offset it. And there was also much less incentive. Only $1.20 in that New York City campaign came from outside spending, in a city that's completely awash in money and real estate interests and all kinds of things where government plays a huge role in people's wealth. There wasn't the same incentive to push money in from the outside. There wasn't the same demand for it because we were moving money in through the system and making sure that that small donors had real value to the candidates. That's the approach that I would take.
Well, public financing is a different animal than what we've been discussing. It doesn't seem to be tremendously popular, at least at the checkoff box on your income tax return to go to the presidential campaign fund. And indeed, the last cycle, for the first time, both major party candidates declined to participate.
Right.
In
That's a
public
broken
funding.
system. That's a broken 1970s era system. It's like saying, your 1974 Camaro doesn't work very well, therefore cars suck. I mean, we've got modern models that are adapted, that are Minnesota's model, which includes public financing and a tax credit for small donors for $50 donations that you can kind of get your refund right away. That's a great model. Huge levels of participation. Candidates rely on it. You don't see the same kind of monster warfare in Minnesota that you have in some of the neighboring states. Arizona's system has actually worked pretty well. It's every place that's enacted something like this, it's generally pretty much politically popular. There are attempts to repeal it fail. Often they break down. Often the systems aren't revised, and so they fall apart.
One part of Minnesota's was enjoined a few weeks ago. I think the large source. I forget what the specifics are, but the Institute for Justice brought this case, a libertarian public interest law firm. I think it was once you get donations above a certain amount, then there are caps on how much future donations can be that weren't there in the first place. I'm not sure if I don't think that part related to public financing, but there were certain triggers to ensure that small donors remained relatively more bigger players in particular races. I'm just wary of having taxpayer dollars go to politicians. That is a little off-putting to me. I mean, I'd rather it be going to whatever we debate about in politics, whatever taxpayer dollars should be going to, rather than funding these campaigns. There are other systems in Canada. I believe there's more public financing, or in other countries where there's even some countries even have prohibitions on private financing, and the parties just get proportionate amounts based on their previous results in previous elections. So there are different models. What you're saying, I think, with the sort of the New York model or the Minnesota model is less offensive to my sensibilities than clamping down on independent speech. But nevertheless, it's still the idea that taxpayer dollars are going to support people who they might not like, or that they going to politicians in general. There's a lot of people who of course don't donate to our system, and they don't want to support campaigns at all. A very small rate of individual donations, small donor, large donor, or anything else, and here they would be essentially forced to as part of their tax dollars. And constitutionally speaking, we've seen the Supreme Court strike down trigger mechanisms where if you have a self-funded candidate or someone who amasses a large enough war chest, certain benefits go to the opponent, whether that's a relaxation of contribution limits, whether it's public funding in the Arizona situation. I'm happy to hear, Mark, what the latest research, what the cutting edge model or theory of public financing is, advancing, past the New York and Minnesota model and what have you, avoiding the constitutional pitfalls that the Arizona public financing system seems to have fallen into. But I'm not sure at the end of the day how many people would actually want their taxpayer dollars going to finance campaigns, given the very low level of participation currently. You might have some pickup if you give them a deal saying, well, we'll have public financing of campaigns, but then restrictions of private donations. But that gets us back to the conversation we were having in the first half hour about restricting individual speech and participation, voluntary participation political system.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess I would make 2 points. One, it actually does seem to be to be fairly popular in places where it's been enacted, and it's a kind of up to date system. The other thing is, if as a libertarian, presumably you think there's a lot of rent seeking that goes along. There's a lot of people who are trying to manipulate government to get something out of it. A lot of those people they're both lobbyists and they operate as donors. If you made politicians less dependent on, not saying they're necessarily going to go away, but you made politicians less dependent on those individuals, and you had less rent seeking, fewer people trying to sneak gimmicks into the tax code, fewer people trying to get a little bit of appropriated money here or there, presumably you'd have overall a less costly government, potentially a smaller and less complex government, not necessarily the night watchman state that you might dream of, but certainly a step in that direction, so that the benefit of the small amount of taxpayer dollars that would go into these small donor systems might be offset, many times over.
Perhaps, but most of what donors get is access. They get meetings sometimes, or their picture taken with the candidate. That sort of. They get a swag, or they get called. The President Bush had the Rangers and the Pioneers and all this kind of appealing to donors' vanity. It's not clear that they're really getting. There's the occasional case where you have like Solyndra or certain other types of scandals, and they're scandals precisely because they have a whiff of corruption about them. But most of these, when you're trying to seek policy change, you do it behind the scenes as a lobbyist, not as one of these super mega donors or super PAC funders, most of whom are oriented ideologically, wanting to see particular policies because that's the policies that they want. Rather than some sort of corrupt bargain, which, as I said, there's a lot better ways or ways to do it that are away from the public eye.
Right. Lobbying and spending money to influence elections are not things that are easily separated, as you could see if you go to any one of the receptions that are in places like the Capitol Grill on any given weekday night. I mean, they're not separate activities, so they clearly have a very big role. And somehow it's hard to the things that are the really, and I'm not buying Solyndra, but the things where there's a really specific deal are that you can observe are few, and there's no question about that. But these things get in the tax code somehow. They don't just appear, and very often they have behind them a combination of who candidates and elected officials spend their time with. When newly elected Democratic members of Congress are told that they should think about spending 40% of their time, fundraising means that they're spending 40% of their time with a very limited class of people. They're hearing about that class of people's problems, the things that class of people wants, and over time that kind of gets in their head. Sometimes that excludes ideas that are great ideas, like, I think, for example, a financial transaction tax would be an interesting idea. Maybe other people don't. There's no way that will ever appear on the agenda of American politics, simply because so many of the people who would be affected by it are the people that members of Congress spend 40% of their day talking to. Or 60%.
But if you removed,
access matters, even absent.
Conversely, or ironically, if you removed contribution limits or raised them significantly, candidates wouldn't have to spend that much of their time fundraising, but they could potentially be more beholden to a fewer number of people. Although if there were disclosures for the high value donors, the voters could judge that.
Right. Well, let's kind of close by having a quick conversation about disclosure, because you've written about Brendan Eich and some of the disclosure concerns that have kind of come up. Disclosure used to be a kind of common ground where both reformers and opponents of reform would say, well, at least we can agree on. Even if you have very few limits, instantaneous, complete disclosure of contributions used to be the kind of backup plan. And I think that's a little overrated. I don't think voters have a lot of the tools needed to really understand why you should be concerned about one donor versus another or any of that stuff, unless something is a really unusual kind of scandal or issue. But disclosure is fine. It's not a substitute for other ways of making sure ideas are heard. But the newer kind of libertarian position is disclosure is dangerous because there's this potential for retaliation, either retaliation by government, which has been alleged in certain cases. I don't think it's real, or retaliation in the private sector, as in the case of Mr. Ike, who was going to be the CEO of Mozilla, but because he'd made a donation to the anti-gay marriage amendment in California a few years ago, he was kind of pushed out of that position by the community that makes up Mozilla. I wonder where we can find is there potential common ground still on disclosure or not?
I think there's some. I mean, Ted Cruz has said, get rid of all limits and have instant disclosure. I would put a little nuance into that and say I would accept disclosure for, again, very high donors. What that very high donor bar is, I don't know. I testified at a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee hearing 2 years ago where one of the senators, White House, I believe, pressed me on, what would the limit be for the House, for the president? And I said, Senator, I don't have a schedule. That could be a political debate about that. But the overall point is that you want it to be the only justification for disclosure is to protect the integrity of elections so voters are informed about any potential sources of corruption, okay? It's not about that voters have a right to know who every donor is, whether it be the $10 donor, the $100 donor, or in a presidential race, the maxed out $5,000 donor.
Right.
At the end of the day is not a big donor, and indeed that interest in private association and being able to express yourself in various ways is greater than the public's right to know about your small donation. Brendan Eich's example is an even stronger one because there the donation was to a proposition campaign. It wasn't even to a candidate, so it's unclear how Prop 8 itself could have been corrupted by someone being, someone donating or whatnot. And you see that the disclosure rules that are so low in California, it's $100. Federal level, it's $200. They're so low that the potential for harassment, retaliation, boycotting, and all of these other things is greater than whatever voter information that piece of disclosure might serve. And there have been documented cases with Prop 8 most recently, but historically, since we've had disclosure laws, about people being harassed or up to physical altercations. But even perhaps more importantly than those circumstances is people being chilled from donating because they don't want to see their name in general. They want to stay, they want to express themselves without having their name in some government registry or even leaked surreptitiously. I mean, in the Prop 8 case, there have been nasty kind of things where some activist group took the public information that was already public, but they started broadcasting them and distributing the address of donors and things like that. So there are dangers, but I agree that for the very high donors, under my system with very high or unlimited contributions, if you donate above a certain amount, let's call it, I don't know, in a presidential race $1 million or $500,000, the bar would be somewhere along those lines, I would think. Then the big boys at that point can really take the heat.
Okay. Well, I think there's if there's common ground, it's on a number somewhere between $1 million and 200 is the federal limit. Now, I think that there's real reason to feel, even without harassment, which I think Prop 8 is a little bit unusual in the sense that something just shifted from being a live political debate to something that's actually kind of considered a completely outrageous position for large parts of the community in a relatively short time. There aren't too many examples of that. But even without harassment, I find, for example, that like if you Google somebody, you might, their contribution record might be the third thing that comes up. But by the same token, I put in somebody's address the other day, and what they paid for their house was because I was dropping something off at their house. What they paid for their house was the first thing that came up. So there's a lot of weird, it's a weird world we live in where the disclosure that you'd want to see on one side, which is really what does this campaign depend on, actually weighs a lot more on the other side, which is what individuals are up to, where there's much less of a public interest. So I would definitely want to, I definitely want to consider moving that number up somewhat. But even if you move it over 1,000 or 2,000, you create a huge opening for people to bundle, 20 of their colleagues, and before you know it, you've got $500,000 to a congressional candidate, and then you have access and you have leverage without anybody seeing any of it. So I think the number has to be. I think it could be above 200, but I don't think it could be $1 million or $500,000. And let me say one other thing about I'm astonished that there's all this pearl clutching about this poor CEO when every day individual workers in this country are retaliated against for their political views, fired for their political views, or required to carry out their boss's political wishes. You had, for example, the coal miners in Ohio who were required to take a day off and required to attend a Romney rally at the same time. On the Democratic side, you had the employees of a union, not union members, but the people working in the union office, were required to go out and campaign for a member of Congress as a condition of keeping their jobs. And that doesn't really have anything to do with disclosure. It has to do with the shape of with at-will employment and the fact that employers can express their political views not only through money but by using their own employees' time. I think that's a much bigger concern than one CEO, and I wish there was as much concern about those kinds of situations on the libertarian right as there is.
Oh well, I mean, just as I defend Mozilla's right to fire Brendan Eich for that reason or any reason, I'm troubled by the my point is on the other side that this donation, when there's no evidence that he was discriminating against gay people in the way that Mozilla conducted its business or anything like that. It's more of a social, I think, problem than a legal or a constitutional one. And similarly, I wouldn't want to work for an employer that commandeered me to, as part of my job, I have to go campaign, do this or that. Hopefully that's on the front end of the contract that I'm signing, that it's not just disclosed to me later on. If there's I don't know if there's labor law violations there. If it's not a government contractor or a government employer, then there probably wouldn't be First Amendment issues there. But I think those types of examples should be highlighted, and the market can judge whether to punish companies for doing that.
Okay. Well, I'd like to see some more protection for employers in those situations. I think
for employees
in those situations, and I think it's a real reminder of just how tremendous the inequalities of wealth and inequalities of autonomy are in this country, that are kind of reinforced continuously by the role of money in politics, by the power that employers have, and really stripping away the rights of citizens. And I think I'd like that to be higher on the agenda of people who think about money and power in politics, on kind of my side, quote unquote. But I'd like it to become an area of common ground. Maybe it can't be, because at-will employment is such an important principle on your side. But most workers don't have the autonomy to say, I need to. They're not signing a contract when they get a job. They're just glad to get a job, and they're pretty dependent. They're pretty much don't have a choice to do what their employer tells them. If you're a coal miner in Ohio and you're told to go to the Romney rally, you're not, you don't really have the option to say, I'm quitting and I'm going to go work for some other employer in this town. So it's a real exercise of power, and that's what we want to find ways to offset. The ways in which power reinforces power and reinforces that kind of rent seeking that both makes government bigger than you want it to be and further strips away our autonomy.
Well, it seems like an odd business practice. Unless every coal company in that town, every other option, was doing the same thing. I don't know whether they're colluding. I mean, there are antitrust laws, I suppose, about that. But because if it didn't help the company's bottom line, which ultimately allows the company to raise wages and hire more workers, if it doesn't help the bottom line, then securities laws corporate governance laws should be taking care of that, and the shareholders should be suing that CEO for taking the miners out of the mine from doing something productive and instead being engaged in something political that wasn't helping the shareholder value.
Well, maybe I think it's a privately held company, and I think that the mine owner thought that having Mitt Romney president would help his company. I don't think that maybe it would have, but that's not for him to decide how the miners' time is used. And I think you can go to towns like this in Ohio. I can't remember the name of the town. You can go to towns like this in Ohio. There aren't a lot of employment options. It's not like it's not like the market is going to act very quickly by his employees quitting and deciding they're going to go work at some other mine or some other.
Well, that's really not an issue with political regulation. I mean, the boss could have said, all right, we're going to all clean toilets today, and that's distasteful, or some other thing or you're all going to mow my lawn today and take care of my house, and these people I need you to babysit, and all of these completely things that are divorced from the practice of mining, and some of the miners might not like that. But if it is a private company, as we're at least as we're stipulating the hypothetical, if it's not the real facts of the case, then it's more of a situation of what are the economic dynamics of the town, and it's a much richer conversation than simply what kind of restrictions should we have on or regulations or disclosures on political activity.
I think it's somewhat different from that, but it is a reminder that we are allowing a system in which a lot of the resources of people who already have wealth and power are kind of used to reinforce the position they already have, and that's not a healthy environment for a democracy. Now, I obviously in a libertarian world, the market will manage these things, and maybe it will, maybe it won't, whether it's shareholders or the labor market. Lots of it's kind of like that theory that discrimination wouldn't happen because ultimately the market would take care of that. Obviously wasn't true. So one way or another, I think.
Well, it depends. I mean, it wasn't true. You're probably alluding to Jim Crow, and there's a whole bunch of state-backed and monopolization, and that's a whole separate conversation.
Right, and probably a bomb I didn't need to drop.
This could be a point of agreement between. I think part of what you're getting to is crony capitalism, and that's certainly a point of agreement between the Tea Party and the Occupy movement.
Right. That's right.
Well, we've got about an hour now. I think this is probably a good place to leave it. I think there has been a surprising amount of agreement between the two of you.
I'll probably get kicked out of the political reform community.
But if there's anything else either of you would like to add on the subject, please go ahead.
No, I enjoyed this conversation. I think I'm really interested in making sure we have further conversations that begin to think about politics with an eye to actually individual liberty as an important value, that we can build election structures that actually strengthen rather than challenge.
I mean, I agree with that. I think a lot of our campaign finance discourse is sort of stuck not just in the the decade after McCain-Feingold, but in the Buckley era. And I commend Mark for trying to break out of that envelope and propose new models, because at the end of the day, you're right. I mean, we can fight out over what it means, what are the components of individual liberty, how you prioritize them, and how you promote them. But at the end of the day, that needs to be the priority rather than the technocratic leveling the playing field, or arguments over systemic corruption versus quid pro quo corruption, and what the definitions of those are, and how that fits into contribution limits and policing of coordination, and all of these, the difference between issue and express advocacy, and all of these mind-numbing legal and political discussions that we've had most recently. So if this is an indication of where the debate is going, I certainly welcome that.
Well, terrific. And thank you, Aryeh, for organizing this and getting me back on Blogging Heads after quite a while.
We're happy to have you back, and thank you, Ilya, as well, for appearing on Blogging Heads. And thanks to our viewers, and we'll see you again next time.